Finally, whether you are citizens of America or citizens of the world, ask of us here the same high standard of strength and sacrifice which we ask of you. With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking his blessing and his help, but knowing that here on earth God's work must truly be our own.
Okay, let's turn now to this speech and ask, how does it work? I've had juniors who actually say out loud, I hate to admit this, I'm 17 years old, this is the first time I ever heard this speech. And I have to be honest, I don't really care much about politics or anything. I've had students say to me, but there is something seriously powerful about what this cat was saying in this speech. It has some sense of speaking directly to me. I've had juniors that say this, and I've had juniors that tell me, I've always heard about John F. Kennedy, and I was told that I was supposed to have some respect for this guy, but I was never actually really given much of a reason why until I read a speech like this. What we want to do, however, is to ask a simple question. We're not going to get into the politics of whether John F. Kennedy was a successful president or not, blah, 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 blah. We'll leave that to the historians to debate. What we are interested in, though, is a simple question. Let's write it down at level 2B. It is this question. It is the rhetorical question that we have to ask, and it's simply this. Why does this speech work? Or how does this speech work? Maybe even better, how does this speech work? So let's analyze the speech in its different parts as we look at this as a work of American literature. John F. Kennedy, of course, knew that this speech would be studied long after he gave it. And so the crafting of the speech was obviously very important for him. Let's speak in the large macro and then the smaller micro in order, okay? So that way we can address this speech in its entirety. First of all, let's just point out that out of a sense of gratitude, he says thank you to the different people who are there. He then will make an observation right away. We observe today not a victory of party, but a celebration of freedom, symbolizing an end as well as a beginning, signifying renewal as well as change. So let's go ahead and put it in our notes. We're going to have in this speech, and of course as juniors we have to give a persuasive speech, so it makes sense to study such a powerful persuasive speech. Notice that President Kennedy, will be looking in two directions constantly in this speech. One, backwards. Two, forwards. Yes? When he's looking backwards, again, we're doing now the macro. We're just kind of looking at this speech as a whole. When he's doing the backward stuff, notice that he likes to go back to earlier American thinkers, the founding thinkers. He loves, for example, to make references to Jefferson. He loves to make allusions or references to Lincoln. He loves to look back to the very beginning of America's history, a history that obviously we've studied in earlier lectures in our class together. And about all of that history, he says one thing. They were right. They were right. The very fact that we're standing here proves they were right. Of course, the other direction is now towards the future. Here, he will address the primary concerns of the day, namely two. International concerns, whether that be, for example, the growing power of the Soviet Union, or the challenges, especially to the south of America, as political turmoil, especially rooted in poverty, is starting to erase its ugly head. The other concern, of course, that he has that's of the future is what's happening in America. And within America, there were two major challenges for Kennedy and, of course, all of the political thinkers of the day. One, of course, was an economic challenge. We had increasingly numbers of poverty, children growing up in poverty, children who were coming to school, for example, not properly fed. And this was a serious concern, growing concern, especially in two places. And ironically, there seemed to be polar opposites. One was in the inner cities. Deeply concerning to Kennedy and to those around him was the fact that growing large numbers of children in the inner city were growing up in poverty. The second, interestingly enough, was the complete opposite. Children living in the completely rural parts of America. They were also impoverished terribly. So that was the first concern. The second concern in the domestic level, and obviously there were more than this, but this seems to be the two major ones, was, of course, the issues of civil rights. The fact that we were a divided country by virtue of race. And Kennedy was acutely aware of this as he uses language, notice, to try and bring all citizens together. And in fact, as we study the poem at the micro level here in a bit, we're going to have to say this out loud. The genius of Kennedy using the word citizen to mean both American citizens and citizens of the world. Of course, in the end, the challenge of this speech is Kennedy will challenge Americans to not ask, what can the country do for me? But rather, what can we do for the country? And in that regards, Kennedy is going to play right into the game of Jeffersonian democracy, as we spoke about it in an earlier lecture on the Declaration of Independence. Okay, that's the overarching. Now let's go to the specifics. And let's walk through this speech really quickly and ask, how does this speech work? First of all, let's point out that at the very beginning of the speech, on page 1104, he says that this is all about history. Everything that came before. I have sworn before you and Almighty God the same solemn oath our forebears prescribed nearly a century and 3/4 ago. 3/4 centuries ago. Right? Or, I'm sorry, 3/4 ago. A century and 3/4 ago. The idea is that history is on our side. History was predicting this moment. But then he points it out. Notice he moves from the past to the present and the future. The world is different now. Notice he already mentions the issues of poverty on page 1105. And he begins to talk about civil rights. The rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. Of course, let's pause for a moment and ask, how is the world different for the time that Kennedy's giving this speech than, for example, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence? That is a legitimate question. By the way, that continues to be a fascinating question in the study of American thought, isn't it? How has America changed? We began, in fact, many of our early lectures, didn't we, on American thought by saying it's quite a different country we live in today than the America, for example, Adams and Hamilton. Of course, to mention anything about the rights of man immediately invokes Jefferson, doesn't it? Notice in the next paragraph on page 1105 that begins with, "We dare not forget that we have passed to a new generation of Americans." He identifies we are a new country. Again, he mentions human rights in that paragraph. Again, slow undoing of the human rights to which this nation has always been committed. That, of course, is an interesting rhetorical sleight of hand, isn't it? To argue that America had always been interested in the rights, the human rights of all people, would make a Frederick Douglass, of course, if he had been there, stand up and say, excuse me, sir, but I'm not sure that what you just said is actually true. Has America always been committed to the rights of all of its citizens? Well, many of the people living in America, slaves, for example, weren't even considered citizens, and women weren't given the right to vote. In other words, maybe Kennedy is saying something he hopes will be the case instead of something he knows to be the case. It's a good rhetorical skill, isn't it? Of course, the key line on 1105 is, "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price," notice here the repetition, "bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of," not America. Did you see the genius here? Don't miss this. This is powerful on page 1105. Not the success of America, but the success of liberty. And then, of course, he begins to use this word pledge. Let's put a note to ourselves. This word pledge is a powerful word. Of course, it's powerful in our nation's history, isn't it? I pledge allegiance, right, to the flag. This word pledge is consistently going to be used now. The promise, if you will, that Kennedy will give to us. He then will begin to make his different allusions or references. Of course, we have the Lincoln reference. You can see in the footnote at the bottom of the page, Kennedy echoes the famous lines from Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, "United we stand, divided we fall." He uses a compelling word picture that we want to make a note of in the next paragraph, "To those new states whom we welcome." Notice he makes the observation, which will be ironic, given that he will make several allusions or references in his speech to different kinds of word pictures from mythology or from Aesop's fables or any of those kinds of things. For example, "But we shall always hope to find them strongly supporting their own freedom, and to remember that in the past, those who foolishly sought power by riding the back of a tiger ended up inside." It's an interesting word picture. It's a great word picture, and of course it speaks directly to this notion you have to be careful who you support politically because it can come back to haunt you. Ironically, of course, just a few months later, we'll begin to have that huge debate about the legitimacy of the Vietnam War, right? Notice in the next paragraph, he begins to talk about the rich versus the poor, and again he talks about how dangerous it is to allow for the poor to continue in their chains of poverty. To speak now in the last paragraph in 1105, as he's speaking specifically to those to the south of America. We should point out just for a moment that many of the challenges that Kennedy is addressing in this speech remain challenges today. Notice at the top of page 1106, he speaks directly to the United Nations, and then of course he begins to make a request. The quest, of course, for peace, as he will say it in the next paragraph. Notice the use of several repeated phrases starting on page 1106. Do you see it? "But neither can two great and powerful groups of nations." You'll begin to see the word both repeated or recapitulated over and over again. "Both sides, both rightly alarmed, both racing to alter that uncertain balance of terror." Do you see it? The repetition of the word both. Then look on page 1106 at the lines to follow. "Let us, let both, let both, let both, let both." Do you see it on page 1106? The repetition is significant. It's almost like a gong, a bell that's going off. It's powerful, and it's a useful way, rhetorically speaking, of course, to help. Notice the famous line, of course, on page 1106, "So let us begin anew, remembering on both sides that civility is not a sign of weakness and sincerity is always subject to proof. Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate." It's compelling in a famous line. Skip down a few lines. "Let both sides unite to heed in all corners of the earth the command of Isaiah to undo the heavy burdens and let the oppressed go free," the Isaiah 58:6 passage. In other words, allusion, write it in your notes at 2b, allusion, A-L-L-U-S-I-O-N-S, allusions to biblical text, important here. We'll see this again, notice, on page 1107, when the reference is made at the very top of 1107. "Now the triumph summons us again, not as a call to bear arms, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation." He's quoting here from the New Testament now, Romans 12:12. This, as your footnote will remind you here. In other words, Kennedy is giving a speech to people who are predominantly aware and knowledgeable of biblical text. We should just point it out. Again, we would ask, is this a reference that would be made today and received the same way? It's a fair question to ask, I think. Notice he continues his word pictures on page 1106. "If a beachhead of cooperation may push back the jungle of suspicion," again, this is compelling, given that the Vietnam contest is, of course, upon us in American thought. We'll continue by making this fellow citizens in your hands, the last line of 1106, "My fellow citizens." It's a major setup that he will use this term citizen because he's using it both to reference Americans as well as to reference people of the world. What a compelling line. Look at the top of 1107. And again, let me pause for a moment because I realize that sometimes you as students of mine maybe do not completely comprehend what I'm saying. So let me say it again. I've said it many times in my lectures on American thought. There is a whole school of thought that says that what is wrong with your generation is you lack patriotism. You maybe have heard this before. You don't believe in your country. You don't believe in its values. You don't care as much about the country as generations who came before you. If that is the case, and I'm not completely sure that it is, but if that is the case, I have said to you often, it is not your fault. It is the fault of an earlier generation who has not given you reason to be patriotic. Because you choose to be a patriot. You're not born a patriot like the color of your eyes. You choose to be a patriot. And I would say to you, studying certain kinds of texts will at least make you sit up and pay attention to the remarkable people who came before you, who gave you this thing called America. Take a look at one of the amazing lines there on 1107 as Kennedy finishes a conversation about national loyalty. The graves of young Americans who answered the call to service surround the globe. Whoa, what a compelling line. Jot down what you think he means by that. The graves, the top of page 1107. Write down what you think he means by that. The graves of young Americans who answered the call to service surround the globe. Whoa. All of the Americans who have sacrificed their ultimate sacrifice, their life, so that you could be sitting here right now. That is a compelling idea. And of course, it begs the question, if that's true, then don't those dead citizens of yours, who are your brothers and sisters of a kind, politically speaking, don't they deserve your respect? Kennedy says they do. They do. I want to point out next on page 1107, did you notice the use of the dash? Now, we've seen the dash several times in this speech up to this point, but begin to notice how the use of the dash, not the period in a new sentence, not even the semicolon, but the dash, to allow for the thought to be well balanced and yet forceful. Notice we begin to see this right away. Now the trumpet summons us again, dash, not as a call to bear arms, though arms we need, and then again, we are, but, dash, but a call to bear a burden of long twilight struggle. And then again, dash, a struggle against the common enemies of man. Notice this is very intentional, very intentional. By the way, he has a nice list, doesn't he, on page 1107 of the things that continue to haunt the nation. Poverty, tyranny, poverty, disease, war itself. The next thing he does is to join this question, rhetorical question. Look at it. Can we forge against these enemies a grand and global alliance, north and south, east and west, that can assure a more fruitful life for all mankind? Will you join in that historic effort? Now, there's going to be a powerful rhetorical, write this down, this is a powerful rhetorical statement, right? Powerful rhetorical statement here as he asks, will you join in that historic effort? Will you be a part of what we're trying to do? Finally, of course, the most famous lines of the speech coming at the end. He says it. I do not believe any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. This is compelling because Kennedy is going to make the argument there is no going back. I would write that down as a powerful rhetorical argument. There is no going back. There is no golden age of America that we want to go back to. There's no time in the past that's a better time, right? He makes no argument about let's go back and make the country somehow something that it once was. There's no sense of that at all. Notice it's a very forward-looking speech. The challenge, of course, is how you get there. Notice he continues, the energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor, by the way, just point out, rhetorically speaking, his love of threes, his love of trinities, right? The glow from that fire can truly light the world. Another word picture, right? Finally, he says it. My fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Note the dash again. Ask what you can do for your country. And then, my fellow citizens. Again, note the genius of this. He says, my fellow Americans, and then he uses the word citizens. And of course, you assume that he's talking to other Americans, but then you begin to realize he's talking to the citizens of the world. All humans, in other words. Notice he uses the word citizens 2 more times. Finally, whether you're citizens of America or citizens of the world, ask of us here the same high standards of strength to finish this. But knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own. By the way, do notice, he did not finish this speech with, God bless America or God bless the United States of America, but rather he said, God expects us to do our work here while we are here. Notice there's a strong religious component then in this speech. Did you see it? All right, that's the work of level 1. Let's now turn to level 2A really quickly. Major messages and themes. Let's say 3 of them, okay? But obviously we've got a number of them. 1, we come from greatness. We are Americans and we come from greatness. He references, of course, the great thinkers, Jefferson and Lincoln and all the other important Americans who come before. Number 2, we have work to do, he says in his speech. We have work to do. That work is on 2 levels. 1, nationally. 2, internationally. And they must go hand in hand. 3, and finally, citizens of the United States and citizens of the world are the ones responsible for progress. We cannot simply speak words. There must be actions that go with it. Ask not what your country will do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. The speech, then, is rooted in rhetorical techniques that we will address now at 2B. Not what the artist says, but how the artist says it. Jefferson is acutely aware of 2 audiences. 1, those audiences which agree with him. Those audiences, that part of the audience that will be the ones who voted for him, who supported him, who very much believe in him. And to that group, he will say, welcome aboard. I'm so happy to be here. Now let's go to work.